Navi's Edward is a player who's been around a lot longer than I'm pretty sure almost anyone watching this video will actually be aware, because yes, maybe people know he has a past in Navi from 1.6, and Navi rose up in 2010, that's when the team was formed, and they were able to dominate, and yes, they were great players afterwards. They came to CSGO, they've now become relevant, they've even been able to win a big tournament. But actually, Edward's someone where, to understand his career, you have to understand what the CIS scene was like, this Commonwealth of Independent States, or whatever that particular phrase was, that is the countries like Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, these sorts of places. Because what you have to understand, Kazakhstan, what you have to understand about this area was that it had a very vibrant LAN scene for almost all of the 2000s. Even though in the West we didn't know much about it, no one knew that these small LANs were going on, all the best teams there would constantly be playing each other at these LAN parties, where every single sort of month, 2 months, there would be a small LAN for a small amount of money, then that would be a qualifier into a bigger LAN. And so as a result, Edward has actually been competing at these CIS LANs since, I think the first instance I found was in like 2003, when he was like 16 years old. He was playing in Pro 100, this Ukrainian team, and he was playing with Zeus, who's his in-game leader now, who he would play with later on in his career. Now, within the domestic scene, yes, he was playing here, he was playing WCG qualifiers, but they were only, this sort of team could only sort of come third or fourth. It was that sort of level. They weren't going to win the big event. Around this time, the big teams was like Virtus.pro, obviously A Gaming would later rise up within Ukraine. Go beyond that, when Edward really came to prominence, became known, was in 2007. Because in 2007, Virtus.pro, which had always been Russian only, it was the best Russian players, and they would always stack up on skilled players, and they'd won a couple of big events like Acon 5. They were known to be like good, always skilled players in the team, but they were famous actually for being the really skilled team internationally that wouldn't win the big event, that would always bomb out in the round of 8 and stuff like that. They would never make the really deep run. Something was wrong with their team. Well, in this particular time, after trying all these different players, they were a team that famously had like a musical chairs effect, where this guy would come in, then 3 months later he'd go out, and this guy would come back in, and they kept trying the same kind of lineups and switching them up, and it didn't really work. So what they eventually did was they took a big gamble, and they brought in these Ukrainian players. I mean, you have to realize the Ukrainian players speak Russian. It wasn't any sort of problem there. But yeah, they weren't Russian players. They were from Ukraine. So they brought in Zeus, they brought in Edward. And around this time, when the first demos started to come out, people already started to go crazy over Edward. He got a massive amount of hype and this huge bandwagon really, really quickly. Before he'd even done anything internationally, he just played some small LANs or some online games, and some POV demos came out. And it's true, you watched them, and his aim was fucking crazy. His spray aim was really nuts. The thing was, he wasn't a player where he would like burst onto you and just do insane shots. He would move the spray onto people and just be headshotting them instantly. It was a really, really high level. And so in 2007, in this new Virtus.pro lineup, that's when they become famous in this sense. Again, actually, they had similar problems to the other Virtus.pro. Yeah, they could get to decent like round of 8 type performances, but they only had one tournament where they won it. That was at all international. They won this Intel Challenge Cup event where it had like Lurpus's team there, 69 and 28A, 28E. It had like alternate there, I think. It had a bunch of decent teams there. Interesting fact for you. Here's a little fun piece of trivia that people won't know about. At the time, one of the people who was bandwagoning the hardest for Edward as like a really good player, because at the time, Edward was like a really good talent. I'd compare him now in terms of where he was in 2007 before he'd really accomplished anything. At that point, he was more like Alu is in CSGO now, where you watch Alu play online and you watch him play like a small LAN, and you'll be like, wow, his skills are really good. Like, oh, what would happen if he got into a top team? But if someone started telling you now, like, oh, Alu's better than Kenny S, Alu's just as good as Get Right. I mean, now, Get Right, it's not as great, but the original Get Right. Or say, oh, he's just as good as, who else would be a ridiculous example? Or even Guardian, maybe. You'd be like, whoa, calm down. Like, you're overrating him a bit. Let's wait until he sees. The person doing that the hardest, and who was almost starting the bandwagon for Edward, was Semphis, the player now who plays for Cloud9 and was their in-game leader a few months back. Except he wasn't called Semphis back then. He wasn't a famous player, and he wasn't even known in terms of the top-level competitive scene. His alias at the time was Terminator. It was like all capitals. And he used to have an account on Gotfrag, which is the equivalent of like what HLTV.org is now, the biggest CS website. And he used to make threads, and he used to post on there, and he used to always comment on how like Edward did like really well in this game even when his team lost, or Edward did really good even with 60 ping in this online game. And he would bandwagon super hard, and he would say stuff like, oh, Edward's just as good as like Forrest, or Edward's better than, let me think of another player of that particular, Edward's like as good as Sunder or something like that. And at the time, he claims after the fact that like, that was just part of me trolling, man, because he does have quite a troll personality. He does like to like fuck with people and get my rate. But I could tell I'm a good judge of character in terms of when someone's lying or when someone's like trying to come off cooler than they are. And in that particular scenario, I know that he actually was a super big fanboy of this guy and he was super into him. So that's an interesting little piece of trivia, because that's where I first encountered Semphis/Terminator there. And I vividly remember, because that's when I kept being like, why is he hyping this Edward guy? Because it was going to be years until Edward really did become this godlike player and really did establish himself in that sense. So anyway, go beyond 2007. In 2008, again, he was, now domestically he would be playing with like Ukrainian teams, but then he'd go to the big lands with Virtus.pro, and with Virtus.pro he was able to do very well domestically. I actually went to some lands there, and all those Aces lands, there used to be like 4 of them a year or something. He'd always place first, second. He was always top 2 in his country, but again, they didn't have the big international results actually. They managed to have one big result at the end of the year, this Rekrut Championship that they had, where they finished second to MTW, the Danish team, who at the time had been the best team of the year. So even that was a pretty good result, and they finished ahead of some of the other good teams there. But you go into 2009, and now it gets interesting, because now he joins this DTS team. And in DTS, he's playing not with Zeus for the first time. He's got away from Zeus. But now he's playing with Markelov, who himself was on the rise. Like, we really started to hear about Markelov in 2008. 2009, he's playing with Markelov, and he's playing with Angel, who's now in, obviously he's in Hellraisers now. And in this team, which would actually that year later on become Hellraisers, at the first part of the year, part of the problem DTS had was they had 4 good or decent players, and then the 5th player was a player whose dad, like, was the owner of DTS or run it in some way, and so they had to have that guy's son in, and so the team could get good, it could get a decent level, like top 8 top level for that, but it couldn't get any further because it was kind of held back by that player. But at the same time, you can't kick that player because his dad, there's some sort of nepotism going on, and so they were held back. So anyway, they got away from that. They became Hellraisers later towards the end of the year, and then obviously the very end of 2009 is when you get Na'Vi is created, but originally it wasn't called Na'Vi. Now anyway, going into 2010, Na'Vi rises up. They win the IEM major, they win ESWC, which is a major, they win WCG. The first team to ever win all 3 of the majors, all of the majors in a single year. They're the most dominant team by far. They win over $200,000, breaking the prize money record. They won 8 tournaments, most of them international ones. They were top 3 in like 12 tournaments, just in crazy stats, domination, like almost the likes that you haven't seen ever in terms of like a very competitive era still. Never did they place outside of, I think they placed outside the top 4 once, and that was the 5th to 8th place. Beyond that, nothing. In 2011 was when Na'Vi won the next major, so they won 4 majors in a row, but after that they never won any other big tournaments, like big ones. They would always place top 3, but they'd never win. They'd make the final sometimes, but they wouldn't win. And so after that, the Na'Vi era of winning didn't really continue. In 2012, the last part of 1.6, again, they made a whole bunch of finals, but they didn't win them. They lost to the Poles in the major final, the IEM. They lost to Fnatic a whole bunch of times in these tournaments towards the end of 1.6. Now, in terms of as a player, the biggest strength that you have to point to in Edward when he was in 1.6, aside from that great rifle spray, was actually his pistols. There was a lot of really good pistol players. Kogu was really good. Forrest was really good. Markov had decent pistols. Get Right had good pistols. There was a lot of good and great pistol players. Neo was a good one. But the thing with Edward was he was like really insane with pistols. Like he would have, and the number of pistol aces he had in like big competitive matches is unreal. And so some of those first tournaments Na'Vi won, like that IEM 4 World Championship they won. There was a couple of games. I remember there was a mouse sports game, I think maybe on Dust 2, or I think there was one against Fnatic as well. I forget which particular map that would have been on, maybe Train, where Edward would just kill like 4, or he'd even ace the whole pistol round. And pistol rounds in CS 1.6 were way more important because you couldn't just buy like a CZ and win the eco back. It's very often you would win at most one, you would have to lose at least the first eco, if not the second as well, if you didn't force spy. Therefore, a pistol round could mean like 3 rounds for your team. So when he could single-handedly win these on his own, it made a massive amount of difference. And he could win, he could give Na'Vi a massive advantage in this sense. And he was a god of pistols. As well as those ones I'd mentioned there, a very famous one was at the Arbalete Best of 4 tournament, where on Tuscan, as CT, he runs down and he jumps into like the little warehouse area and he just spams the USP like this and kills all 5 Fnatic players. I think like 4 of them were headshots as well. It was utterly fucking insane. It's one of the most insane maybe the best pistol round ever played in 1.6. That's the level this guy was on. And that was the map which actually clinched the tournament for Na'Vi. Not that round, but that map. Going beyond that, his rifle spray. again, he wasn't like a Scream type go straight 1 or 2 tap for the head style player. He was like, he would spray non-stop. Now, you wouldn't notice that because a bit like Forrest, his first 4 to 5 bullets was so insane that he'd get the headshot and it just looked like a 4 to 5 bullet burst. But unlike Forrest, where he would actually use technique, Edward really would just spray. Like, he would do full auto all the time, even at like a long, not like a fully long range, but like at the edge of sort of what we'd call medium range. He would just spray full auto. And he'd spray full auto while moving. Like, he'd spray at you while moving around like this, which didn't really work in 1.6. I know people coming from like the ADAD era in CSGO might think, oh, could you do that? Was there accuracy? No, the accuracy went to shit actually when you moved like that. But his spray control was so good. I always felt like he actually, if he'd have applied technique and been really controlled, like a Forrest type guy, he could have actually been way better player than he was. And he already was a top 10 player in the world. And when he was at his best, a top 5 player in the world. But he could have been even better. He could have been right up there with the Neos and Forrest if he'd applied more technique to his spray. Because he would actually abuse, he would lean on the fact that he was so insane at controlling it and have these like really aggressive pushes in or just like moving while doing it. And it felt like he just like took for granted how good his spray was. And I think he could have been a bit better, even though he was already a great, great player and he accomplished many great things. The thing about him was, he had certain positions he was very, very good at as well. Because if you put him in like a mid to close range area, it was over. He would just, like I'm saying, his spray's so good, he would just batter the enemy. So a couple of positions he was really good at. One was playing outside on train as CT. He would either push up to that electric box near the pop dog train where the little ladder is, and he was amazing at knowing when to look left and when to look right there, because that's the problem with that position, is that if you're looking towards the pop dog and they come out there, but then someone comes behind you from team mid, then you're just going to get shot in the back and instantly killed off. Someone's coming from flanking you from the alleyway, coming inside from when they smoked off the CT arch, then if they come in, they're going to shoot you in the back. You have to be really, at that point, it's not just knowing where enemies are and tendencies, you have to have like a really good intuitive sense for knowing where to go. You can't just be looking all the time or you won't take advantage of having your spot you held. You have to have a really good sense for how to do it, and he had an amazing sense for that. Also, he would play around there to set up the enemy to come in really slow and look there, and then he would go up the tower, up the big ladder, and look down and just shoot them in the head for free, or shoot them when they came out of these 2 entrances, the team mid or out of the alleyway. He would just shoot them, get very easy kills, and so as a result, added into all the rest of what Na'Vi could do on that map. That's part of why they were so dominant. One of the secrets to Na'Vi on that map, by the way, is that every single player, through no design, it just so happened the positions they played were also their best positions on that map, and some of them the best positions in the world on that particular map out of every player there was. So when you added it all together, that's why Train was like the home map for Na'Vi, and they were nigh on unbeatable on it. They might have lost like 7-8 games on Train ever as Na'Vi. That's how insane these guys were. They were really amazing, and he was a big part of that. Another position he was really good at was on Inferno, which actually was kind of Na'Vi's like flex mid pick, which it would usually be between Inferno or Tuscan, what they play as the third map. And they didn't particularly like Inferno. They could be decent on CT side, but they had problems getting T side rounds. Well, part of what made them good on CT sometimes was Edward was really good at playing in the pit, in the site, or in the lane area. That side, but over to where the car is now in CSGO. He would play that area, kind of where Forrest plays now, Shocks plays. But he had really good timing on this of when to look into the house as they're coming out, when to look lane, when to look behind you when they come. Again, his timing in this sense was quite good. He had quite a good feel for the game in that respect. Now, beyond just the particular sports he played or his strengths, you have to talk about the fact that because he did abuse the spray so much like that, and he did have an intuitive sense, when you add those two things in together, where you don't have a godlike technique, so you're not going to be perfect all the time, and you're using a feel style game, therefore sometimes your feelings are going to be wrong, your intuition is going to be wrong, and you're going to make the wrong decisions. He wasn't like a super hard carry. Markelov was the main, like almost every game in Na'Vi, it felt like Markelov was on top of his game. He would always do at least very well. So oftentimes he'd carry, like there was a while where Markelov was like Kenny S is now, where every game you just knew he was going to drop the 20, 25 frags on CT half. Edward wasn't like that. He'd have the 1 in 3 games where he went crazy. He'd have 1 out of the 3 games he'd do like pretty well. And then he'd have 1 out of 3 games where he'd do bad or below average for what you expected from him. But what made Na'Vi work was that StarX, at least during their prime of 2010, 2011, was able to play sort of the hybrid carry support third star role. And when Edward would dip down a bit, that's when sometimes StarX would have a good AWPing game. Or he'd have a game where he'd win a bunch of 1v2s. And that added into it, kind of covered up Edward's weakness a bit and allowed Na'Vi to still be good because they didn't just have only the one carry. The other two could kind of be interchangeable to a degree. Going beyond that, we come to CSGO. Now, in the early days of CSGO, Marklover was decent, but actually Edward was the main guy in the middle body of 2013, who was probably the best player for Na'Vi. He was doing the best. And when they left Na'Vi and they went out to Astana Dragons, that's when Edward first really had his real problems. Because actually, as a 1.6 player, he'd been having problems at the end of 1.6. The end of 2011, going into 2012, there was all these stories like, will they kick him? He was having problems. But they stuck with him. In 2013 rather, in CSGO, he'd initially picked it up. He was doing well. Then, when he gets into Astana Dragons, he was clearly the guy who was having big problems. Now, I've always put it down to this. Some of the spots he played, kind of the way he played the game, he played a little bit like Dossier, a little bit selfish, a little bit slow moving around the map, certain spots that were like similar. And so I always felt like he was the guy where he got kind of pushed over into other spots he didn't necessarily want because the other players had their established positions. So he wasn't as effective. So anyway, they kicked him out the team. He went back to Na'Vi. In the end, that ended up being great for him. His form revived. You saw in early 2014, yes, it was Guardian who was the leader, whose games would lift Na'Vi. Yes, Starix would have some okay games. Seized, particularly if he went crazy, was when Na'Vi were at their best. When Seized wasn't going, they were just like a top 4 team. But that's when they had the chance to win, was when Seized at its best. But Edward was like the most consistent player in Na'Vi at this period in time. His rifling was pretty solid. And so I felt like he's kind of refound himself as a player. He's never going to be the star he was in 1.6. The game doesn't suit him to the same degree. And plus, like I say, pistol rounds don't have the same level, although he's had some great pistol rounds in CSGO. It's just that they don't have the same impact on the game. They don't win you 2 rounds automatically. So that's who Edward is as a player. He's an interesting player because he started really overrated, then he did get incredible, then he went back down to a degree, and also that little story about Semphis. In fact, I'll tie into that another little funny story for you. So Semphis, who was bandwagoning Edward really hard and saying he's better than he is, interesting fact, Edward, when he was coming up as a player, used to be a massive fanboy of Forrest, which, let's face it, like nearly all of us were in a way, because the guy had by far the best aim. He was incredible in CS, like amazing skills. So Edward used to like check his config, watch his demos and stuff. And so there was a period of time when Edward got into Na'Vi and they were the best team in the world, where Edward used to put his name in game, because Forrest used to put it as Forrest WoW. Edward used to put his name, he used to use a fake name in actual games, not call himself Edward. Sometimes he'd call himself Focus WoW, and he'd do the O as a 0 like Forrest does, so it'd be Focus WoW. And so there was a period in time when Forrest had a dip in 2010 and Edward was on top of his game, where I could literally make the joke, and it was accurate, that actually Focus WoW, who's a fanboy of Forrest WoW, so I called himself that, Focus WoW is now better than Forrest WoW, and that actually was the case. So there's just an interesting connection there of like fanboys who become famous players and get to play them, even get to beat their idols, because you have to remember, Cloud9 have placed ahead of Na'Vi in tournaments. And Semphis has finally been able to beat Neo and beat Forrest. And it's crazy how the game can change and how kind of your perception from before can be different when you apply like time and the changing effects since. So that's who Edward is.